onto your butt.
Da-da-da. Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 153 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Once again, I'm joined by Mary, a woman who is still hungover from Rum Spring of 2004. I am just a poor excuse for a man tonight named Darren. Good dog and we bished, Mary.
Wow.
What's going on?
Well, happy to be back recording again. It's been a few weeks since we dropped our last episode, so it's good to be back here. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing pretty good. Studying the world of Grundsatzen this last week, preparing for this episode. So while we get ready with this, I will be a very gracious host, because you probably would have forgotten otherwise. And I'm going to ask you, of course, what is it that you were drinking on this fine evening?
I am drinking a hazy IPA from Rusty Rill Brewing, which I believe is a Pennsylvania brewery. You might consider it local to the Gettysburg area. I don't think it's... Yeah, whatever.
Well done.
And how about you? What are you drinking? Wow. Sorry. I'm drinking it out of my Joshua's Restaurant and Tavern mug. This is from Brunswick, Maine, and the tavern has unfortunately since closed.
It's closed.
Yes.
A good little place up by Joshua Chamberlain's place. Anyway.
So what are you drinking, and what mug are you drinking
Mary.
it out of?
Thank you so much for asking me that. It's a very important question. I'm drinking, it's called Tidewater, and it's from 1781 Brewery out of Spotsylvania, Virginia. We were there last weekend, and I'm drinking it out of my issued Knights Templar mug that I got,
nice.
Even though there's really no connection whatsoever to that. But it's one of those sort of things we're going to kind of talk about a little bit. You know, out of the many groups we've talked about over the years, Mary, the Irish, the Germans, and shall I say Canadians,
Yep.
There's one group of people who lived in this country during the Civil War who are rarely discussed. And those are the non-resistors whose religion did not allow them to fight for either side. Specifically, the Amish and the Mennonites, whose history with the Civil War is really extensive, but to this day remains to be extremely understudied.
And I do think it's important to, tell our listeners that this was your idea that you came up with. It was when we were at the Strasbourg reenactment, and we were, I think, waiting for the train to arrive, and you looked over, and in a field there was an Amish family, and you were just fascinated by it, and started wondering then, like, okay, well, did they fight in the war? Because they're pacifists.
Yeah, being a city kid and seeing Amish, I went through about a 12-hour period where I thought I was going to become Amish because their life was pretty simple. But, the thing about it, though, is anyone who's seen or interacted with the Amish or Mennonites like we have that weekend, especially here in Pennsylvania, they quickly learn that they are a different breed. Mm-hmm. And their values even today mirror their ancestors who arrived here centuries ago. Now, to understand the plight is to first understand the religious revival that took place in the antebellum America, in what was called the Great Awakening. And by Great Awakening, I don't mean you finally wake up at noon after a hard night of drinking IPAs, Mary. This is a different Great Awakening. This Great Awakening was due to the large Protestant population here in the growing number of Roman Catholics in places like Boston, places like New York City, due to Irish immigration. Now, I should note, Mary, that somewhere the priests who taught me my religion classes back in college at Chestnut Hill would be thrilled to know that I still remember some of the stuff that they taught me.
Yeah, well, we learned a little bit about it too in Canada, because where I grew up there, I was maybe, 45 minutes to an hour from what is considered Amish country in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. And then in the northern part of the county where I grew up, you would often see Amish and Mennonite as well. And there were some of the houses that they didn't have electricity. So it's something that I was familiar with, but I never thought of their connection to the Civil War at all. Because it's not something you think about, because you just assume, well, they're pacifists, so they likely didn't participate in it.
Oh, no question. Now, due to immigration, not just them, but all immigration, faith became very important here in America. Religion had always been a large part of the lives of people like the slaves, as well as, we talk about that. With their scripture foretold the coming day of Jubilee, which would deliver their freedom. And this institution of slavery was also what caused a split in the Protestantism between Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians. Episcopalian Henry Clay, Mary, wrote in 1852, quote, "If our religion cannot live together in peace, what can be expected of our politicians?" Now, the religious impact of freedom can be found right on the official seal of the Confederacy, too. Mm-hmm. Deo Vindica means God will vindicate. It's right on the seal. And you see that sometimes when you see Confederate writings.
Yeah.
But each religion had their own tenets, and some of these beliefs would put them in direct conflict of their government. Two of them were heirs to the Radical Reformation in 1520 to establish the New Testament Church on its own terms, focused on the concept of Anabaptism, which is voluntary adult baptism as a proof of their eternal faith. Now, their religion forced them to avoid civil oaths with a complete disavowalment of violence, even in the case of self-defense. Now, the Anabaptist concept caused a schism with the other religions who felt adult voluntary baptism was, quote, radicalism. So by 1614, over 2,500 Anabaptists were executed by the Catholics and Protestant leaders, which drove them away from society to places like farms, which over generations allowed them to become experts in agriculture. That's really how they got to the farms. The leader of this Anabaptist group was a Dutch German named Menno Simons, a former Roman Catholic priest who was excommunicated for his beliefs, and he created a following who would be called the Mennonites after his name. Soon after, another schism took place within the Anabaptists in Switzerland, of all places, which produced basically kind of a spin-off led by a guy named Jacob Ammon, whose followers become known as Amish. Now, they disagree over things like church discipline and, but overall, but they're basically similar in a lot of ways, with some small differences between the two, speaking about the Amish, the Mennonites. They were among those who emigrated to the United States when 80,000 Germans came here to Pennsylvania in 1770 as part of William Penn's Holy Experiment. Right? So by 1860, there are 40,000 Amish and Mennonites in America, spread out over Virginia's Shenandoah Valley and as far north as Ontario, in which basically came to avoid religious persecution like a lot of people did back in the day. Now, the Amish had over 70 American congregations in 1860, divided by two factions. One that embraced traditional values in the conservative old ways, shunning worldly entertainment, dressing in homemade plain clothes, praying individually in their private homes, etc., etc. The other Amish group was a little more progressive. They would pray in meeting houses, they set up Sunday schools for their children, and they became a little more involved in the outside world, to commerce and things like that for some of the seculars. Where they were united, it was that 100% steadfast belief in pacifism, okay? They believed that since Jesus Christ didn't defend himself at the crucifixion, that Anabaptists would also denounce violence in all ways, including self-defense, to follow his example. So part of the pacifism was their refusal in any way to participate in the military under any circumstances. Amish men wear beards, but they do not wear mustaches because in the 1600s England, English soldiers wore mustaches to show they were soldiers. So having a clean upper lip was the Amish way of telling others that they refused to be part of the military, a tradition that still holds today.
Interesting. I remember you explaining to me that we saw a guy walking somewhere, and I said, "Is he Amish or Mennonite?" And you said Mennonite because he had the full beard, because Mennonites will have a full beard.
Well, the mustache.
Right? Yeah, or the mustache.
Yeah, the Amish, for the most part, it was their way of kind of, look at me, I'm not, it's kind of going the opposite way. But when the Civil War approached, it began a complicated relationship with Anabaptists who were pro-union and anti-slavery, and their governments who saw them as citizens who were required to what? To serve the country in the time of need, right? Kind of the deal. Especially those large numbers of Mennonites and Amish who settled in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, where 300 to 350 Mennonite households in Rockingham County, Virginia also existed, which was smack dab in the middle of the Shenandoah Valley.
Yeah.
So again, by 1860, the majority of Anabaptists, they opposed slavery, but mostly for economic reasons, right? And it's kind of obvious. And since they were farmers, they opposed slavery in the South due to the fact that it gave Southern plantation owners really an economic advantage by allowing them to create more crops, undercutting prices because they had no labor costs. They did feel slavery was an abomination as well. I mean, basically feeling that since there's no slavery in heaven, there should be none on earth too, right? And so as we go into 1860, what happens in 1860?
You have Abraham Lincoln being elected.
I've heard of him.
President, and you also have in December after he gets elected, you have the secession crisis happening as well.
So when it came to the time of the presidential election of 1860, most Mennonites and Amish would vote for Lincoln. And if you look at the numbers, I looked at some of the election rolls from back in the day. 68% of the Amish in Lancaster County voted for Lincoln. Despite getting elected with just 39% of the national vote, this threw gas on that secession crisis you just talked about, resulting in the firing of Fort Sumter in April of 1861. But when Sumter was fired upon and the Civil War began, the fears of both Amish and Mennonites were realized, right? Peter Hartman, he was a loyal Mennonite from Harrisonburg, Virginia, loyal meaning to the Union.
Yeah.
He wrote, quote, "The news made us all weak and almost made our blood run cold. There is a tremendous storm brewing in the South, and when the storm breaks with all of its fury, it will shake the South to its very center."
You have to wonder too how much of it some of them knew about, because it seems like they don't. I don't want to say they don't participate in society, but you wonder if they're reading like the same newspapers as people.
They definitely read the papers.
Yeah, and how they're getting their news as well and finding out about this crisis going on.
Well, when the war did broke out, it caused pain within towns and even families, and when it raged for the next 4 years. For the Anabaptists, especially who lived in what they called the, quote, two kingdoms, this was living in their religion and the secular government where they lived, but especially when it came to military participation. And this is the whole thing with this. You know, in pre-war Virginia, men from 18 to 45, this is pre-war now, they were required to spend 4 days a year with the state militia, which allowed religious non-resistors, which would be the Amish and Mennonites, mostly Mennonites of Virginia, to pay about $90 in military taxes to avoid having to participate. Sounds good. In Pennsylvania, many Amish and Mennonites were vocal in local politics, and some actually held office. They were mostly part of the Whig Party at the time. But for Mennonites in Virginia, the heightened patriotism versus the independence fever that was going on put them literally between a rock and a hard place, right? Well, again, what made it difficult was when Virginia was debating to secede now, they were caught in that political dilemma because they knew at the time you had to vote. You had to vote publicly. You had to state your vote. It isn't like now you go by a little thing and pull the curtain. You got to state your point. And there are a lot of people who voted in Virginia for Mennonites, so they had to get the vote. The newspaper, the Rockingham Register, one that respected the Mennonites and the Dunkers, who were kind of their cousins, that non-resistance stance. The newspaper wrote, quote, "They carefully and promptly pay their taxes to support the government, which protects the slave holder as well as themselves." Now, when Lincoln called for the 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and Virginia's secession crisis really took off and really made it inevitable, that newspaper quickly changed its tune regarding these non-resistors. And this is the quote that came afterwards, okay, after the 75 were called up. Quote, "Only demagogues and traitors would vote against secession." And they began to court the Mennonite voters to vote for war because they needed the votes. The paper's editorial section, they wrote, quote, "The Mennonites and Dunkers love their country and desire its peace too much to vote against secession. Surely they knew that if Lincoln were to march his armies over our land, he would point his bayonets and loaded guns in their faces too." So again, they're facing local pressure to vote basically for war. And because they needed the votes to happen. Jacob Wenger, he's a Mennonite from Greenmount Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. He said that he was threatened by locals with hanging if he didn't cast his vote to secede. Right? On May 23rd, 1861, you know what happened that day?
That's the day that Virginia secedes.
There you go. They voted to secede from the Union and no longer needed to cater to them for their votes anymore. The Rockingham newspaper turned on the Mennonites now, and they wrote, quote, and you can see the difference how these things change. This is after they voted to secede. Quote, "If some Christians are too conscientious to hold slaves or have anything to do with the institution of slavery, that might be their right. But should they preach against it, they can expect utter extermination of their peculiar religion." So again, being a non-resistor in this period of this white-hot Virginia patriotism, it forced the Mennonites in the valley to basically keep a very low profile.
Yeah.
Right? There were still Unionists who opposed slavery but felt significant pressure to support Virginia in what they called a, quote, unholy rebellion. So just imagine where you are at this point, right? I don't mean in that chair. You're in a situation where you know that the government, you have a protection of Virginia. You're not going to have to go fight based on past rule. You're getting a lot of pressure to fight. Now that the fighting is going to happen, what's going to happen, right? So they go back to their farming business as usual, but soon they began to do what they could do to protect and hide Confederate deserters. These are the people who just walked away, didn't want to fight.
Yep.
Weaver's Mennonite Church in Rockingham County regularly hid rebel deserters in their church and sometimes accompanied those fugitives on their escape out of the area. So what's going on in Pennsylvania? The local newspapers in Lancaster County, they also regularly attack the Amish for their pacifism and lack of support for the army. Despite what you may have heard, Mary, they were not living in an Amish paradise.
I didn't think so.
Okay. June 19th, 1861, the Lancaster Evening Express, they wrote, quote, "Since treason took up arms, we have not heard of a single population withholding support for the Union. But now we learned of the Amish convention near Strasburg, and they had decided to contribute neither men nor money to our cause." The article went on to say that the Amish were some of the richest farmers living happy and free in the area. And, quote, "If there is a people who ought to be grateful for the government and willing to contribute substantially, the Amish farmers owe this debt." And it continued, "Would they rather have their fine horses taken by rebel thieves or to use them to defend freedom? But these rich but, quote, closed-fisted farmers should expect no sympathy if the Confederates overrun Lancaster." I know some close-fisted people, Mary, especially at the Harper's Ferry Brewery.
Yep. Oh, yes.
Pops in my head.
Yep.
If I think about that, as a matter of fact. But again, this unfair propaganda was untrue as the papers and locals in the county tried to guilt the Amish into donating money towards the war effort. And again, in both Pennsylvania and Virginia, we're going to focus on those two primarily.
Yep.
Peace became a very unpopular thing, and war frenzy gripped everyone.
Now, the one thing I'm wondering too is if they're, kind of being forced to donate their money, are they also, were they forced to donate things like horses and their crops that they're growing to help out with the war effort?
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that, but things changed really dramatically going forward. Now, there were some rules that were interesting about this too. I mentioned before, when you were an Anabaptist, you got basically baptized when you were 18 or 19 years old. The ages vary, but it's right around there. If you did not get baptized yet, you were not considered an Anabaptist. Therefore, all these rules about not having to fight did not apply to you, right? So if you're under age 19, you were ineligible to be considered a non-resistant, while those who had been baptized and wanted to enlist, they faced the dilemma of being permanently shunned or expelled from the church. So think about it. You're 18 years old. You don't get baptized till you're 19, right? Just in this case. You want to go fight. You're 18 years old. You're full of piss and vinegar. You want to go fight. If you did, you're gonna get shunned by the order, and you're probably gonna be excommunicated. And this is the dilemma they had. Ezra Yoder, an Amish from Wayne County, Pennsylvania, he wrote, quote, "I wanted to volunteer, but my parents and my church being non-resistors, so they wouldn't let him." So later in the summer of 1861, when Lincoln called for an additional 400,000, this is when the pressure really began to be turned up on the Irish, on the Amish, and the Mennonites. Now again, this concept of violence was the deal breaker. It just was. A guy named Dwight L. Moody, an Amishman from Lancaster County, he wrote, quote, "There has never been a time in my life when I felt I could take a gun and shoot a fellow human being."
Yeah, well, that's the one quote that I found was that we don't shoot people.
Yeah, don't do it. Yeah. They're part of that two-kingdom philosophy that they call it, of obeying these Anabaptist teachings, which is pure pacifism, and a genuine commitment for the Union that prevented the Amish and Mennonites from enlisting. So for young teens looking to join, not been baptized yet, again, they're feeling that constant pressure from their
Yeah.
parents to avoid the war at all costs, while maybe some of their friends or people in town, if they associate with them, are signing up and going.
Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine how difficult that must have been.
Oh, yeah.
Now, it's what came next that really caused a problem for the Amish and Mennonites in the North and the South, and that was mandatory conscription. And that's when the rubber hit the road with a lot of this stuff. By the end of 1861, the thought that the war would be a quick one, would be kind of, 90-day papers will be
Yeah.
over, they saw their enlistments expiring. Suddenly, the North needed more troops. And Lincoln famously said, quote, "The bottom is out of the tub."
Yep.
Right? It resulting in the dismissal of Secretary of War Simon Cameron, and then they brought in Edwin Stanton in January of 62. But again, pressure grew in the North among the Amish and Mennonite communities to join the fight, while in the South, the need for soldiers was even worse, right? Virginians still had the option, like I said before, of getting out of military service by paying that fine that went to the Army.
Yeah.
But as Bob Dylan once said, Mary, times they are changing, right? Confederate recruiters began to show up at Mennonite meeting houses in Virginia. And when their service was over, they demanded all men 1845 to report for military training.
Wow.
Rebels told them if they wanted to follow Jesus and go to the, quote, second mile, as written in Matthew 5:41,
Yeah.
which I'm sure you knew, they should sign up with the rebel army and agree to do the term twice as long. So they try to spin the Bible the other way to try to convince them.
That's crazy. And like the other thing too is like, and I'm sure you'll talk about this, but just what, men like Thaddeus Stevens are doing.
Yeah, we'll get into him in a bit because he's a huge part of this story
Yeah.
going forward, especially for the Amish in Lancaster County. But a Virginia non-resisting Mennonite, he's told by a rebel recruiter, quote, "You ought to go and be shot at, even if you cannot conscientiously shoot back." He's basically saying, go be cannon fodder.
Wow.
If you can't shoot back, you can still die. So why don't you do that? For the Mennonites who could not pay that fine, they had three choices. It was about $90 at the time. They had three choices: accept service, join, and then leave and face death as a deserter,
Yeah.
or go into hiding.
Yeah.
This is the choice they had. On April 16th, 1862, the first Confederate Conscription Act was passed, and mandating all men 18 to 35 now must serve 3 years, and then basically while the draft quotas were going.
Yeah.
So if you needed to do it. They also considered taxing non-resistors into poverty, but doing so they felt would bring God's wrath down in the South. And there was a newspaper correspondent in Virginia who said, quote, "Beware that we provoke not the majesty of heaven to anger." And he went under the name Justice. That was his name he did. Because, you're religious, you don't want to tick off the big man, But July of 1862, poor Mennonites and Amish in the South had no way to avoid military conscription, either except to risk their lives by hiding or be treated as a deserter. So in Rockingham County, which is down in the valley, a group of non-resisting Mennonites visited their minister named Samuel Coffin, and they pledged to him that if forced to fight, they would refuse to kill. And a Mennonite who was drafted in the 146th Virginia with the amazingly appropriate name of Christian Good.
Wow.
He became involved in a skirmish in late July 1862, and he was assigned to be on the front line. Good was asked by his captain, quote, "Does your weapon work?" To which Good responded, "I don't shoot." The captain then said, quote, "Don't you see all those Yankees over there?" And Good responded, "No, they're people. I don't shoot people." So this was the common thing about the men. Similar, Mennonite Jacob Wenger, he was arrested and sent to a guardhouse for refusing to shoot. They would load their guns up and they just wouldn't shoot them. People, and they'd find these muskets filled up, loaded with balls, and that's a lot of them were the non-resistors who, it wasn't all of them, but a lot of them that was the case. Officers had no choice but to assign these people to jobs that are non-fighting jobs.
So they're going to be doing things like, just like, I guess you could call them like the Teamsters work. So they're going to be helping build the roads. They probably would be dealing with looking at after the horses. Things like that.
A lot of the non-resistors who did fight in Virginia, they took jobs as teamsters, shoemakers, woods clowns, other non-combatant roles, right? There's a song, it's called Am I a Soldier of the Cross? It was a Baptist tune of the day, which was commonly sung by Mennonites in camp to help them remind them of their loyalties. I think the 80s rock group Stryper actually covered this song back in the day, Mary. You'd be cool if you knew who they were.
I've heard of them.
Okay, never mind. But there's one thing. It was one thing to get drafted and another to actually show up, as many Mennonites and Amish who were conscripted immediately went into hiding and never returned. I mean, that's what they did. Confederate brass feared a serious manpower shortage, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis, he ramped up their conscription efforts. But realizing the issue was with non-resistors, he finally realized he had to include an exemption for non-combatants.
Yep.
And Rebel General Stonewall Jackson, he reported 18 Mennonites in his brigade had been arrested for deserting and had been reassigned to those non-combatant roles.
But wouldn't Jackson is, I believe he was a Presbyterian. I think he would probably have, and I think we were talking about this one day, that Jackson did have this kind of, I don't want to say empathy, but just he understood where they were coming from. And he did, like you said, he did assign them those roles where they wouldn't have to be in combat.
Right. He was a little more empathetic. That's a good way to describe it. He had empathy, understood, because he saw the big picture with this. That Confederates conscription law offered these exemptions to those members of pacifist churches that prohibited them from taking up arms. Exactly. And they could do it by how? By paying a $500 fee. You know how much $500 worth today is?
That's got to be hundreds of thousands of
No,
dollars.
not that much. That's why I do the books.
Yep.
It's worth about $16,000.
That's still like,
it's a lot of money.
That is a lot of money when you think what the average income was in the 1860s. Like,
But as the ShamWow guy says, Mary, but wait, there's more. Okay, you also had to pay 2% of your entire total assessed property value to Richmond. So if you had a big farm in Rockingham County, you paid $500 and 2% of your land value.
and they were like, the Amish were very well off, were they not? Like
A lot, right?
Yeah.
A lot of them were, because they worked hard, they spent thrift, and they knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
Those who couldn't afford it would basically be assigned those non-combatant roles, like we said, and Jackson definitely supported it. But even with these non-combatant roles, many felt that it was still too close to war. Mennonites still left in droves, which further infuriated the Virginia newspapers and locals, because now it's like you put them in these roles and they're still disappearing, right? Again, the $500 exemption did not include those Mennonites who had not been baptized yet. So if they were conscripted, their only hope was to what?
Yep.
See you later. Go out for a pack of smokes.
Yep.
That was their only choice. 19-year-old Mennonite Manassas Heatwool.
whoa, that's quite the name.
He was unbaptized, and he was drafted into the 52nd Virginia Company F. He deserted. Quickly, he was caught. His regiment found themselves fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg, fighting along the stone wall on Culp's Hill against the 2nd Mass and 27th Indiana. Mudge's guys, right? Heatwool would desert again, and this time he escaped and made it all the way back to Ohio. Never heard from him again.
So he was from Ohio and fighting for the Confederate.
No, he's from Virginia.
Oh, Virginia. Oh, and then he went to Ohio.
After Gettysburg, he
Oh, okay.
must have jumped on the B&O Railroad. Right? But you know what? The other thing that was going on at the time too was hiring substitutes. That was still a thing. It hadn't been banned yet, but it was expensive. Hiring substitutes basically was almost like the stock market. The rate for a substitute in 1863 in the South was close to $6,000. A cool $190K today.
Wow.
And the prices rose and dropped like a commodity. They also allowed civil servants to avoid the draft as well, and many Mennonites and Dunkers took advantage of that. There was a man named Abraham Blosser. He paid $1,000 to get a job as a mailman just to avoid being conscripted in Virginia.
Wow.
He's Mennonite Newman, right?
I'm picturing that now.
Oh, yeah. But, I mean, you wonder, though, like, when you think about it, wonder how much of your ancestors would have paid for a DQ job back then,
Yep.
right? I bet the blizzards made with unpasteurized milk were really good, though.
Ew.
I don't know. I think that's pretty good. But those Mennonites in Virginia who could not pay, they put their lives in immediate danger, especially those who openly criticized conscription. Bishop Samuel Kaufman in Harrisonburg, Virginia, he openly denounced the draft from the pulpit. And soon, Confederate color guards showed up and threatened to take his brother and other family members capable of fighting for the Confederacy. Kaufman ended up fleeing to Pennsylvania after being consistently threatened of his life. And again, the stories of Mennonites escaping to the North, it rivals that of the slaves escaping on the Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
And I think people don't really understand or appreciate that the Mennonites in Virginia had safe houses, and they would sneak these deserters of these brother Mennonites from house to house to get them north. And never ever talks about the Underground Railroad for the Mennonites.
No, it's quite interesting, and I think it's something that, like many things with the Civil War, something that needs to be looked at more. It's not just like a side of war, but it's this like culture of people that their lives are being disrupted because of it. And two, one thing that would be interesting, which I don't think we'll be able to get into in this episode, is to know that how many of those Mennonites were, sent upon this Underground Railway for Mennonites and Amish, and how many of them stayed north after that, and their descendants are still living there now because of that. There probably are some that are living in the north still, their descendants.
I mean, I'm sure there were. A Mennonite named Samuel Rhodes, he kept a diary of his attempts to escape north, and he went into hiding with a relative. March of 1864, Rhodes said he made his escape and met 50 or so other Mennonites and Dunkers along the way. They made it past Petersburg, and they got lost. So Rhodes and his men had to decide to go home and try again. Good at agriculture, not good at maps, right? So he moved from place to place for 6 weeks while being hunted by rebel scouts. He finally made it to Newmarket, Virginia, where he stayed at the home of a minister. But he found out that minister was a Confederate sympathizer, and he dropped dime on him. And he got out of there before the authorities came, because they were going to rat him out and he would have been arrested. Rhodes spent the rest of his life on the run. Never came back. In December of 1862, he made it to Altoona, Pennsylvania, and he worked as a carpenter. And this is when Lee invaded Pennsylvania.
Yep.
He escaped to Hagerstown, Maryland, where he died on April 26th of 1864 while in hiding.
What did he die from? Do you know?
No idea. Probably an unpasteurized blizzard.
Oh.
But not all Mennonites were Union sympathizers, though. I mean, most of them were, but some, like Bishop Jacob Hildebrand from Stanton in Augusta County, Virginia, were pro-Confederate. And when his son Benjamin, who signed up with us 52nd Virginia at age 42 to honor the Dominion now and forever. So some of them did it, but
wow.
Back up north in Pennsylvania, these northern non-resistants, mostly Amish, also had their share of struggles. Again, it was no paradise, right? By summer of 1862, northern morale was at a new low. You may remember why, Mary. George McClellan's Peninsula campaign was fizzling out, and suddenly the Union had a serious manpower shortage of their own. Now in Pennsylvania, previous law took precedent for religious conscientiousness in these objectors, and politically, the Amish were very active and were more than happy to support the Union in more military ways.
Yeah.
Now again, conscription hadn't made its way north yet, just as the states were still filling their quotas, but by the summer of 1862, the Union desperately needed more men. They were running low. July 17th, 1862, Congress began the discussion of a national conscription plan. This is the North now, and passed a new militia bill empowering Lincoln to call up state militia into federal service for up to 9 months. Now, the bill was signed on August 9th, and it required all 18 to 45-year-old men to enroll in a draft where the names would be called literally out of a spinning wheel to fill out the rolls if the quotas were not met.
So the anniversary of that is on Saturday.
Coming up, you got it. Now, the slots not filled would be filled by conscripts from that list. And so the hint of a possible forced military service scared the wheels off the Amish black wagons, Mary. And when that first draft was announced on August 15th, 1862, Amish lobbyists swung into action. They began calling on Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, demanding exemption status for non-resistants, Amish and Mennonites. Now, Lancaster County, they sent preacher Amos Herr to go see Curtin, and at the meeting, Kurt asked her, quote, "What do you people do for us? Do you vote?" And Herr reminded the governor that yes, they did vote very much. Oh, and by the way, we vote Republican. To which Curtin then responded, quote, "Well, I guess we'll have something for you for them. We'll have to figure something out for you then.
Yeah.
So losing a sizable voting bloc who could vote for peace Democrats was not a bluff that Curtin wanted to call. Again, it's all politics. You're seeing these governors flipping, New Jersey, New York.
Yeah.
He didn't want to lose his job. And he knew that if he lost the Amish and Mennonite population and they voted for the Democrats, everything would have been different. So he caters to them. Now, Curtin put his money where his mouth was, to his credit, and he created a provision for the Amish and Mennonites to obtain a formal conscientious objector status. Anyone signing up for the status had to legally affirm they were conscientiously refusing to bear arms, even in the case of self-defense or country, and belonged to a church with a long-standing pacifist tradition in relation to war. That's exactly how it's written. They had to pay an exemption fee, which was to be determined at the time.
Yeah.
So the next day, 312 Amish and Mennonites lined up for their certificates.
Wow.
Which immediately drew backlash from the secular people and even those in charge of giving out the certificates. There was a guy who was a commissioner of Montgomery County in Pennsylvania named James Boyd. He would bully and shame those by asking. You have to ask those questions. He would say, the question he asked, quote, "So you would stand by and see your wife and children murdered and not save them?" And he was hoping that they would say, "Well, of course I would." And then he'd make them exempt.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how they did it. But most of them stood firm. The cost of substitutes also skyrocketed in the North, where brokers were peddling $1,000 a substitute, which the Amish saw, again, as supporting the war effort. And few took advantage of it. If you're paying someone to go take your spot, you're supporting war.
Yeah.
And so they never really got involved in that. How do you think the local newspapers treated the Amish?
Probably not very good.
The Lancaster Intelligencer wrote, quote, "Is it right to exonerate only those who belong to a particular denomination of Christianity?" Well, locals were predictably negative about the exemptions for the Amish and the Mennonites, who knew they only got them because of how they voted. They knew they were. It was in Curtin's bag. They saw the Amish and Mennonites as hypocrites, because why would they support a party that's fighting a war when they're peace and there's a party preaching peace and they wanted nothing to do with that?
Yeah.
And the question for that, again, goes back to the slavery issue. It goes back to the union issue. They were still anti-slavery and they were still pro-union, but they were very pro-peace. So you can imagine how complicated this whole thing was. In Mifflin County, Pennsylvania, just northeast of Harrisburg, a note was posted downtown by an anonymous person. This is what it wrote. Quote, "Take notice, all Dutch who took the oath not to bear arms in defense of our country are warned if they vote in this election," this is the 1862 midterms, "their buildings shall be laid in ashes. So I say, take warning in time before it is too late." And he signed it, "To be drafted I am."
Wow.
So he said, if you're voting in this election at all, and we see you, we're going to burn your farms down. I mean,
wow,
here's what it is, right? Seeing family members conscripted to fight while these perceived rich Amish and Mennonites claiming religious exemption didn't have to. I mean, you can see how it pissed a lot of people off.
Oh, yeah, completely, because people who can't afford it obviously are going to get pissed off at them for it. And likely there's not the understanding there of the religious aspects of it as well. So people just aren't going to understand.
Right. And the anger really ramped up when Lee and his army moved into Maryland and then eventually Pennsylvania. When Lee invaded Maryland for the first time in 1862, Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania, he called out the state militia to help defend the state from an impending attack into Pennsylvania. The Lancaster Express, the newspaper, wrote, "Every man must become a soldier. He who doubts will be damned." So they're writing on the religious side of it too.
Yeah.
Saying if you don't fight and defend, you're going to hell.
Yeah.
The caves and all that.
The
fire,
caves.
Right?
The caves.
So they're trying to get into that whole thing. Now, the Confederates obviously stalled before getting into Pennsylvania, but some rebel scouts did get there, and they did steal horses, including 3 from a Pennsylvania Mennonite named Andrew Lesher. So they did feel it a little bit in that point. Everyone knows about the Dunkers in Sharpsburg, Maryland.
Yep.
They evacuated the town after witnessing the fighting on South Mountain on the 14th of September, and they returned to find their now famous meeting house all shut up following the Battle of Antietam. And again, one of the many byproducts of the Battle of Antietam, though, the most important of the war, in my opinion, was that it allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, opening the door for black troops in the Union Army. But the problem is, initially anyway, for Lincoln, thinking he was going to be getting a whole new source of troops initially backfired. Because while they were coming in, many white soldiers deserted in early 1863, primarily due to sickness and the fear the war was never going to end. I mean, don't forget, they just come out of Antietam.
Yeah.
I mean, the hell with this. This is ridiculous.
It's not just that. Like, so you're coming out of Antietam and then going into early 63. You're also coming out of the Battle of Fredericksburg. And then you have the Mud March. And this is, I didn't think I would get this in, but I'm going to.
Oh, here we go.
There is an Oliver Otis Howard reference. In his memoirs, he writes that this point, this late 1862, early 1863, and specifically because of things like Fredericksburg and the Mud March, it was kind of the low point for the Army of the Potomac. And he remarked that it was, the lowest point they had ever seen at this time.
No, absolutely. Now, when Lee did return north in June of 1863, especially when Confederate cavalry under fun lover Albert Jenkins, he stole countless horses from Amish and Mennonite farmers. That panic set in that the war was finally actually coming to Pennsylvania. The boy who cried wolf was finally telling the truth. June 27th, 1863, 3 rebel soldiers came to Marion, Pennsylvania, the home of Mennonites Michael and Rebecca Hodge. And what do? They lined up Mrs. Hodge and her 2 daughters at gunpoint, demanding money from Mr. Hodge. After Hodge gave the troops what he had, the troops then ransacked the house looking for more, telling Mr. Hodge, when they were done, we're going to shoot you. Hodge then, he got down on his knees and began to pray when a Confederate put a pistol to his head in front of his family. And just before he pulled the trigger, another rebel yelled, "Don't shoot," and then all 3 ran out the door. Now, what the rebels knew was that Hodge was not going to defend himself.
Yeah.
And it was his Mennonite faith, but Hodge was preparing to die versus defending himself and his family. So it kind of gives you a specific example of how sometimes, they do back up their words with actions.
Yeah.
And again, many of these Amish and Mennonites had their farms robbed, losing everything from horses, wagon wheels, other valuables, and they rushed and hid as much as they possibly could.
It sounds a lot like, and it's not on the same, it just sounds a lot like what you hear coming out of Georgia during Sherman's March to the Sea, except this isn't Georgia, it's Pennsylvania, and it's Confederates doing it.
Mm-hmm. When Confederate Corps Commander Richard Ewell rolled into Chambersburg, Pennsylvania on June 15th of 1863, you know where he made his headquarters?
In an Amish
The
house.
Chambersburg Mennonite Meeting House.
Wow.
It was in this meeting house that Ewell conducted 4 courts-martial, and he issued the orders to Jubal Early to march east over the Susquehanna and attack Harrisburg. Now, Governor Curtin was freaking out as bad as you are when the DQ machine breaks down and there's a line of Cub Scouts waiting to get in, right? Curtin messaged Edwin Stanton begging for help, and the newspapers were losing their mind. The headline of the Harrisburg Daily Telegraph said, "The war is upon us." And again, Lancaster's mayor, a guy named George Sanderson, he held a town rally implying all citizens to take up arms to defend their soil. And again, not surprising, the Amish did not rally to Sanderson's call, and many took off and fled. Those Amish who did stay behind did so only to protect their property. Now, Early's army approached Wrightsville, just 15 miles away from Lancaster, when the locals burned the Wrightsville Bridge, which ultimately kept Early's 10,000-man division on the western side of the Susquehanna and kept them from plundering Lancaster and all those farms before they eventually turned to Harrisburg. So you think about how much that saved burning of that bridge.
Yeah.
Now, one of the buildings Early did burn in his mission was the Caledonia Iron Works, owned by a representative and abolitionist named who?
This is Thaddeus Stevens.
Thaddeus Stevens. And Stevens' district included Lancaster. And Stevens was a BFF of the Amish community. Stevens' Democratic critics saw the Amish relationship with Stevens as, quote, as a hypocritical pairing. But Stevens called these non-resistors in his district our most loyal men.
Well, and of course he's going to just, agree with them or side with them because he, too, is anti-slavery. He's an abolitionist.
He is. But he also knew the power of the vote.
Yeah.
And he wanted to vote Republican.
Yeah.
When conscription started, Stevens made sure to protect the Amish in Lancaster. When Senator Henry Wilson from Massachusetts, he introduced the bill in early of 1863 to create the National Guard, the one that eventually turned into the National Conscription Bill. Mm-hmm. Stevens refused to support any legislation that did not have an opt-out fee for the Amish and the Mennonites. Stevens said on the floor of Congress, quote, "They are willing to pay taxes, but I do not believe that they should be forced to violate their conscientious and religious scruples." So if it's on the floor of Congress, you see how serious this non-resistor issue was, right? The conscription bill was rolled out on February 25th of 1863. It did include a $300 exemption when it eventually became a law a month later. Stevens traveled to Lancaster to let his Amish constituency know. Now, the draft inevitably came to Lancaster on July 19th to the 21st of 1863, basically right when everything was going on after Gettysburg and the Wrightsville Bridge burning. The drafts, and I looked up the draft yielded 3,362 men from Lancaster County. 1,214 of them, 36%, paid the $300 exemption fee, which bagged a cool $364,200 in 1863 money.
Wow.
Right?
Did you look that up in today's?
No, my calculator didn't go that far. 26 of them had previously paid for substitutes in the past. 1,417, 42% of them were exempted for physical reasons or having civic jobs, like a mailman, for example, right? In the end, out of the 3,362 men drafted in the Lancaster County draft, only 705, just 21%, would go on to serve in the military. That's how powerful this exemption was. So results in other Mennonite-heavy counties in Pennsylvania showed very similar numbers. So if you're in Washington, it's clear that the $300 exemption thing was crushing draft numbers. So in early 1864, what does Lincoln do when he calls for 200,000 more?
He puts the price up.
He tries to, and then he doubles down and brings another 300,000. Yeah. And this led to things like the New York draft riots and all that stuff we talked about, 105 dead in New York City. The rallying cry in Lancaster was $300 or your life. That's what they said. But again, this fee was not that much of a burden to these wealthy Amish, who also, by the way, had Thaddeus Stevens and Andrew Curtin in their back pockets, and everyone knew it. The Lancaster Daily Express, again, the newspaper, frustrated over this class war that was brewing over the draft. Literally printed, you know what they did? They printed the names and the income figures of every Amish family in Lancaster County.
Wow.
Which enraged everyone for different reasons. What the paper didn't say, though, was the total dollars donated by Amish families for the war effort, including the countless blankets and socks that they made and sent to the soldiers for free.
Yep.
But they took what everybody made in the last taxes and they post them saying, "This is how much this guy makes. He doesn't have to fight." What do you think about that?
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. But, So a push was made in December of 1863 to bump the fee from $300 to $400. But again, Stevens put the kibosh on that, and the fee stayed $300. That's how powerful
people must have been so annoyed with him. Because he's
Oh yeah. But Stevens, in the final conscription bill in February of 64, also added that non-resistors who could not afford to pay the $300 would accept non-combatant roles like hospital workers, teamsters, etc. But there is not record of one Amish person in Lancaster County who took one of these non-combatant roles.
Oh.
They didn't do it. The National Provost Marshal, James Fry, he wrote, quote, "The exemption fee made the draft worthless." He wasn't wrong.
No, he's not, especially if they're getting nobody from Lancaster County.
In Lincoln's latest draft, this is Pennsylvania statewide now, it showed 14,471 names drawn, only 9,961, 67% statewide, enlisted in the military, with 5,050 paying the exemption fee. This is statewide. This is not just, so this is how impactful it was. So in June of 1864, Stanton agreed with Fry and said, you know what? I'm going to remove that exemption clause from the draft law. The hell with this. But little did Stanton know that when Thaddeus Stevens helped write the original bill, he foresaw this might actually happen. So Stevens had added a clause stating that the religious non-resistance exemption fee could not be removed.
Oh, good
So
for
it
him.
stayed. So the exemption fees for other things, civil workers, things like that, that went away, but the religious ones stayed.
It's giving him some more background to when, you watch the Lincoln movie and you have Tommy Lee Jones playing him and you think like he's a cool character in it, but you can see that he's like a thorn in the side of many of the politicians in DC. And now this is like adding another layer to that to understand that he's been at this for so many years being, like I do agree with what he's doing and I think it's brilliant, but he is a thorn in their side.
I mean, you're fighting a war. Things aren't going great. You have thousands of young men who can fight, and they just don't.
Yeah.
When the 1864 election took place, the Democratic Lancaster Intelligencer again printed, quote, the inconsistencies of the Mennonites and Amish, which have become grave and religiously offensive in these deplorable war times.
Well, it's showing how much that this is not just a religious thing, but it's becoming wrapped up in the politics of it as well.
Well, that's what the paper was saying. The
Yeah.
paper is saying, the quote continues, it also said, quote, the Amish are defenseless and harmless, but when it comes to voting for candidates for office who are for war, their consciences suddenly are not so tender. In re-electing Stevens and Lincoln, the Mennonites and Amish only help continue the war. So what they're basically saying is that we have political muscle, we're going to flex it. And then it went on to another paragraph talking about McClellan. He wrote, quote, where is the voice of Christian moderation and forbearance? McClellan promised peace and prosperity as a national man and a Christian who was not a politician like Lincoln. And again, the only person angry at the Amish in these parts was probably you when you got stuck behind one of their wagons, right? On Route 30 heading to York every morning.
I've never been stuck behind one. Now I'll get stuck behind one.
Of course you will. Now, one thing the Amish and Mennonites did in Pennsylvania was they voted in those loyal blocks. And this was the crux of the whole thing with this. Thanks to the relationship with Stevens, who was protecting them. And they helped elect Lincoln and Stevens in 1864. Mm-hmm. Lincoln carried Lancaster County 13,466 to 7,987, with most non-resistants voting for the Republicans. So the point that many secular citizens were saying wasn't wrong. How can a religious group so focused on the peace side vote for a party that was considered pro-war?
Yes, I agree. That I can see why they had that question.
But again, remember, most Amish and Mennonites were also anti-slavery. They were pro-union. Even though some Maryland, Virginia Mennonites and the Dunkers would borrow neighbors' slaves because they wouldn't take them themselves, but they were happy to borrow some, which is what that's all about. But the 1864 election began a national discussion about religion versus war. And not just in Pennsylvania, but also places like Ohio, Indiana. It was sparked and fueled by enrollment waivers for non-resistance and support for freed slaves in the post-Emancipation Proclamation country, right? Mm-hmm. In 1864 Virginia, the Mennonites continued again, speaking of Virginia again, to live fat on their farms in the valley. Now, although harassed by secession neighbors and occasionally by soldiers, they were for the most part left alone. And a big reason for that was they were in the valley and their crops were directly feeding Lee's army in the east. And that's the thing. If the men are not fighting war, they're at home working the fields, they're going to generate more crops. Yep. So Richmond took advantage of this. They said, well, we're going to demand a collection of foodstuffs from Mennonites and Dunker farmers, and we're going to charge them 10% of their entire crop, which to Richmond was worth way more than a few $100 in taxes.
Yeah.
So you get a visit from the Confederate pressmaster, would mean a family would be required to hand over 10% of their entire crop without even notice. So they began to hide food so they couldn't find them. But the pressmasters, I originally mentioned this a little while ago, they began to take themselves horses, wagons, anything they wanted. It turned into a free-for-all at this point. And so the concept of exemptions played just as badly in Virginia as it did in Pennsylvania especially when those war losses began to really mount for the Confederates in 1864.
Yeah, and in 1864 too, you have Sheridan in the Valley as
Right.
well.
Yeah. By 64, the Confederacy had we're going to get to him in a second. By 1864, the Confederacy also had abolished the substitute system, and they'd expanded the age of conscription from 18 to 35 to 17 to 50.
Whoa. I was going to say, when you said 13, I was like, what?
No, it wasn't that bad. But they did leave the conscientious objector policy in place, which allowed non-resistors to pay $500 to avoid the drafts. Moving the age down to 17, though, caused a problem for the Mennonites and Dunkers. Why?
Because of the baptism aspect of it, because they don't get baptized till they're 18.
They were not baptized yet. This meant that 17-year-olds who were no longer covered by this religious exemption. So until they were baptized, they were not officially members of the church. If you're not a member of the church, then you were done. So, Mary, you're 17 years old. You get drafted. You have no choice. What are you going to do?
Probably Jeep.
Again, you're going out for a pack of smokes, right? That's what you're going to do. A Virginia Mennonite preacher named Reuben Heatwole, began a network to help 17-year-olds escape, including this one time in band camp when he helped 15 17-year-old men escape north. Again, this is the other Underground Railroad no one knows about.
Yeah.
Despite the desertions, the farms in the valley remained full, because theoretically they only took 10% of the crop. You still had 90% left over. And you had all the able-bodied men work in the fields. There was talk among the seculars that the Mennonites and Dunkers were hoarding more food than they were. But in reality, no, they actually donated a lot of food to other families.
Yeah.
Hungry families. They donated. They gave a lot of food away that no one ever talked about. But this animosity continued to a slow boil in Virginia as rumors spread that the non-resistors' wealth, coupled with their own wartime miseries by families who did not go off to fight. So anti-resistor hate peaked in the valley in June of 1864 when the quiet grumblings turned into jealous violence. In the town of Broadway, Virginia, Mary, a 66-year-old dunker named John Klein, the men in his parish, they called him Elder Klein, was rumored by locals to be aiding underage sons escape from Confederate conscription. Klein was also openly anti-slavery, anti-secession. He expressed his opinion freely, one of those guys. One night on June 15, 1864, Klein was returning home from seeing a sick neighbor when he was ambushed by rebel partisans and shot to death. Klein's death shocked the Dunker community, which ultimately forced more men to seek exemptions and avoid fighting for the Confederacy, and increase efforts to funnel those young Dunker kids north and away from rebel authorities. Mennonites are going to soon learn, though, and you just hinted a few minutes ago, that they're going to have themselves a two-front war here soon.
Yep.
So spring of 1864, the Shenandoah Valley was under the command of General Jubal Early. After failed attempts to take the valley by Union generals Franz Sigel and Dave Hunter, commanding General Ulysses S. Grant was done messing around with the valley.
Yeah.
And he put General Phil Sheridan in charge.
He also had to separate Sheridan and Meade.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Because he finally realized he had to cut off the Confederate breadbasket. Grant created the Army of the Shenandoah and told Sheridan, quote, follow Early to the death. Now, to carry out the plan, Grant wanted Sheridan to focus on hard war and destroy as much food and supplies as possible. But again, don't burn private homes.
Yeah, we did an episode about Sheridan in the Valley. I think it was last year.
It was the Meigs episode.
Yeah.
So from August to December of 64, Sheridan unleashed hell on the 125-mile long, 25-mile wide Shenandoah Valley. But again, sadly, most of the farms targeted and burnt by Sheridan's forces were those of the pro-Union, peace-loving Mennonites. Virginia Mennonites suffered the lion's share of the trauma from the burning and quickly learned that being loyal to the Union meant nothing. Mm-hmm. September 8, 1864, the chief of staff of the Union's middle military department, a guy named James Forsyth, he commanded the cavalry to, quote, destroy all mills, all grain, and all forage, kill or take all livestock, but avoid burning private homes. Sheridan himself, he said of this, reducing civilians, this is his quote now, reducing civilians to poverty brings peace more surely and more quickly than does the destruction of human life. Okay. Now, you're right. We did an episode of the burnings. We're not going to get too much into that. But regardless of loyalty to the Union and being Mennonite non-resistors, the farms of anti-resistors like Reuben Swope, Samuel Weaver, Noah Wenger, and Benjamin Wenger were all put to the torch by Sheridan. Benjamin Wenger was a Mennonite deacon who lost his home and the farm in the fire and went to Sheridan's headquarters to apply for a pass to the north. If you remember in the episode, Mary, Sheridan made offers to the non-resistors, the GTFO, if they wanted to leave. L.J. Heatwell, a very popular name in Virginia, Mary, a teen at the time and a future bishop of Rockingham County, called the experience, quote, a holocaust of fire. When it was over 400 wagons loaded with Mennonite and Dunker refugees left down the valley heading north, and according to Mennonite Peter Hartman, the wagon train extended 16 miles.
Wow.
Many underage Mennonites snuck on these trains in these wagons to get the hell out of Dodge. So you can imagine word is going to spread back in Pennsylvania of what's going on at the plight of their Mennonite and Dunker brothers in the valley. The Daily Evening Express of Lancaster published a long story on the refugee crisis in the valley and put a Union spin on it, saying basically the fires freed their brothers and sisters of the Confederacy. I mean, many of these refugees sought shelter in Pennsylvania, but since they were from Virginia, they were denied the ability to vote in the 1964 election. It just was, right?
Yeah.
But for the rest of the war, non-resistors on both sides had no choice but to ride it out, and the best they could do was really just wait for good news.
Yeah.
And what good news came on April 9th of 1965?
Is going to be General Lee surrendering to General Grant at Appomattox.
It does. And it's going to affect everyone, including the Amish, the Mennonites, the Dunkers, the Rosewoods clown, everybody, right? Post-war and post-Lincoln assassination led to changes that disrupted society going forward, obviously. Washington stepped into a welfare role with the South. The Northern soldiers began to receive pension payments, the earliest steps towards Social Security. We're not going to talk about Reconstruction or anything like that. But new cities in the North began to spring up, and immigrants flooded into the eastern cities and basically began to create a strong central government now. Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction stood at odds with Republicans and brought the ire of people like, guess who? Thaddeus Stevens, right? The creation of the Freedmen's Bureau helped several schools in the South to educate young and newly freed black children. Many Amish and Mennonites from Virginia actually went further south to volunteer to help build and teach in these new schools. Jacob Yoder, a Mennonite from Berks County, Virginia, he taught in a makeshift school in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1866 and oversaw a group of 24 teachers and 345 African-American students, right? So Yoder and his Mennonite and Amish teachers blended their teachings with the students' promise of their Day of Jubilee, which led to Yoder's creation of 24 schools that spread over 6 Virginia counties using Mennonite theology to spread their teachings to convert many of these freed people.
Wow.
One of these black Mennonite churches set up in the Civil War, or post-Civil War in Hampton, Virginia, became the largest black Mennonite church in the country in the year 2000. So it started
I did
still
not
there,
know that at
right?
all. I did not know that.
Also, many of the Mennonites who had fled to the north slowly began to return to the valley to try to rebuild their lives among the burnt ruins of their farms. But when they got back, I mean, they found their neighbors weren't too friendly.
No, they wouldn't be.
Emmanuel and Elizabeth Swope returned to find much of their property stolen. Their neighbors wouldn't talk to them. And it was just a real sad situation across other parts of it. But for the Amish and the Mennonites who did fight, most of them returned home to find themselves completely ostracized, stunned, or completely kicked out of their church for violating their beliefs. A guy named Abraham Schenck, who was an Amish from Lancaster who enlisted to fight in 1862. When he returned home to Lancaster, his name was referred to as Krieg Shank or War Shrank by his community, and they basically shamed him to leave for good. Never came back.
There's probably a lot of sad stories like that.
Well, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah.
I mean, no pun intended, right? I mean, because if you fight, you you're going to be cut off. If you
Yeah.
don't fight, you're going to be cut off from the other side. That's that two kingdom thing.
Yeah.
And that was the whole dilemma with this, was it creates a moral dilemma in that debate over religious consciences versus desire to fight for your country is more front of mind,
Yeah.
right? The Mennonites in the South who lost their properties to Sheridan's fire, they tried to file claims to the government to get reparations. What percentage of properties do you think were claims were put in by Mennonites or
Zero.
Dunkers?
Oh,
No, submitted.
submitted probably 70 to 80.
85%, okay? Few, if any, were allowed.
I was going to say, that would not have happened.
The Mennonites, the Virginia Mennonites' loyalty to the Union was a strong factor in the decision to try to pay them, but often these claims were rejected because they accepted the authority of the Confederates at the time. They had no choice, obviously. Also, they gave 10% of their crops to the Confederate war machine.
Yeah.
And again, against their rules, but that was what they did to deny the claims. A hog farmer named Isaac Wenger, he filed a claim of $1,765. But they said since he didn't, this is my favorite one, since he did not carry, quote, guerrilla warfare against Richmond, that he was not entitled to his claim.
So they're just making up excuses for not
paying.
Yeah.
That's what they're doing. These Mennonites in Rockingham County were the ones who helped the young men escape Confederate conscription, and they openly refused at the risk of their own lives to fight, and Johnson's government didn't care. In Pennsylvania, the Amish in Lancaster County, they weren't persecuted at this level, but they were mostly ostracized from a secular society, and it took generations for them to assimilate back into a normal relationship. Even today, the scars of the Civil War are still present in Lancaster, as not one monument exists there honoring Amish or Mennonites who did violate their religious oaths to fight for the Union. There's no mention of it anywhere. In 1962, Vincent Harding, an African-American Mennonite pastor and historian, wrote of those days of the Civil War era, quote, "Our persecuted Anabaptist forefathers were a minority, forever in danger for their lives and always threatened with the swift destruction of their property. Forgotten what it is to rejoice in suffering for Christ's sake, forgetting our comradeship with the outcasts, forgotten how it was to be fools for Christ's sake." For modern-day Amish and Mennonites, the question still lives today in the minds who struggle with that two-kingdom philosophy in the effort to honor their God and still serve their country. The memories of the Civil War were the foundation of this dilemma that are still felt today in the Amish and Mennonite communities. Though they didn't fight, their impact was felt significantly by both sides, and like the Amish and Mennonites of today, that aspect of their history, like so much of their present existence, is still shrouded in mystery. Mm-hmm. And that's their story.
Yep. Well, it's an interesting one, and thank you for finding that book that you did and reading it and, doing, well, pretty much all the heavy lifting on this episode.
Well, Danky, you were all wrecked for an English remaidal.
Jeez. But yes,
I've gone down a bad rabbit hole with this whole thing.
No, it's interesting, and I love that you did, because it's a whole other aspect of the Civil War that I think doesn't get talked about. We just did the episode on Canada. Again, another aspect of the Civil War that, I now want to study more of that, because it's fascinating. It's fascinating how the politics play into it, how, you have different viewpoints, which we discussed in the episode. But it's the same with the Amish too, and it's amazing to see. And what is interesting is just how woven religion and politics becomes, and just the animosity it is causing in these communities for non-Amish who are not understanding the Amish religion, and getting angry.
Well, again, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. You're completely stuck in the middle. And if you're going to be a non-resistor, you're going to be a conscientious objector, you're going to be subject to this. We saw this in Vietnam. We saw this in World War I, World War II.
Yep.
It's just something that came along, but really in America, this is really the first time it really had an impact. And it impacted both sides.
Yeah.
And like I said a few minutes ago, it still shows today. It still does. It still
Yep.
does. So what's coming up for us next, Mary?
So our next episode is going to be in a couple weeks. We are going to be talking about General James B. McPherson. doing an episode about his life.
I've heard of him.
Yes, tragically killed at the Battle of Atlanta. So we will be doing that. And then we've got other fun stuff planned. We do have on Labor Day weekend, we are going to be at Gettysburg.
It's going to be our 5th year anniversary, Mary, of this podcast. This podcast has gone longer than the entire Civil War at this point. So on August 30th, from 6 p.m. at Gettysburg in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, we are going to be hosting a party with the great folks at Gettysburg. We're going to have live music and possibly some other entertainment we're going to find out about. It's all free. You can buy drinks and cigars there, but there's no fee for this, obviously. So if you're in the area, come by. We'd love to see you and talk about whatever's on your mind. And then we got some other things coming down the road as well.
We do.
All right.
Yep. So thank you to our listeners. Thank you to you, Darren, for all your hard work with this. And yes, we are going into our 6th year of this podcast.
Crazy.
Now, which is crazy.
Well, it's a love of the game. We definitely enjoy it. So hopefully people have a great weekend. Hopefully you enjoy this episode. Hopefully if you get out to places like Rockingham County, Lancaster County, places we've talked about, and you see these folks, just understand their plight. People go out there and look at them, and it's weird to take vacations to Amish country. But these people have a very difficult lives, and they really, in the Civil War, everyone had a really difficult life. But for them, it was actually extra hard. And again, no one studies it. And it's just that's the aspect of this that it just under the rug for some reason. And unfortunately, they won't be able to listen to this because they don't. But so if you want to make fun of them, go knock yourself out. But but for the most part, it's a very interesting, very complicated story that still goes on today. Yep. All right. So why don't we jump off? So anybody has any questions, Mary, you can jump on in at this thing we go to. If anyone has any questions about the Amish, you can ask Mary all the thing about the 5th anniversary. Have fun with that. And hopefully people will come out and enjoy the day. All right. So hopefully we have a great weekend. We'll talk to you all on the other side.
See y'all soon.
Danke.
Bye.